and welcome to my video. I am Hazel from Hazel A Patterns, and this video is the full tutorial video to show you how to make the Hoopla project bag. And here it is. This is my latest pattern, available to download. The links will be below, and by the name you can tell it's designed to fit a hoop. So this fits an 8-inch, maybe even a 9-inch embroidery hoop. And inside the bag you'll see it has a little pocket to put all your threads and any other accessories you need. Now, what makes this bag special and a bit different from anything else I've done is I have used piping for it. Piping is absolutely ideal to use when you're making a circular bag, because if you have any problems with your stitching not being quite straight, which does happen when you're stitching in a circle, the piping will hide all of that. So let's pop that to one side. I will show you what you get when you buy my pattern. So first of all, my patterns are always quite condensed, so you just get a short tutorial. It's got 14 photographs in it, lots of instructions, and then instructions on how to print the pattern. So that first of all will tell you what you're doing. This video obviously will expand on everything. So this is great if you are a confident sewer. Keep watching if you want to see more. So you then get a guide to making and using fabric piping. Piping is something that not everybody's familiar with. It's quite a common technique in upholstery and furnishings, but not necessarily so much in bag making. So I've got a full guide, big photographs, lots of words explaining how to make the fabric piping, and I go into it in great detail during this video. And then last but not least, you have the pattern pieces. So it's 9 pages to this pattern, and then at the end of it you've got a cutting chart which has all the details of what you're going to do. So great for helping you to plan your project. So what I will show you now is what we are about to make. This is the version of the Hoopla project bag that we're going to make in this video. It is gorgeous, amazing fabric. I love using bright fabrics for myself, but they don't photograph very well. But they're ideal for video. So we're going to be making the bag. You can see inside I've got a smaller project that I'm just about to start working on. Room for my threads, and I use the stripy zip. Oh, it's so lovely. Let's pop that to one side, and just in case you're not sure how your fabric would look in this, I have more versions. I've got a lot of friends that do cross stitch, and let's just say they might be getting some presents sometime soon. There we go. So without any more ado and faffing, let's get on with the video. So before you start sewing, you're going to need to print out your pattern pieces. So first of all, make sure you've downloaded and saved the file. Don't print it straight from the internet, and then print it out using a custom scale 100% or whatever you found that works. And the first thing you'll need to do is test that the 1-inch square is actually measuring 1 inch. Then what I always do is cut out all the pattern pieces. If they have multiple pieces, the easiest thing to do is leave a little lip on one side and then glue them together. So join them up, making sure that the squares match, and then you have all your pattern pieces. You've got your cutting chart at the back. You'll see that there's a couple of pieces that don't have pattern pieces because they're just simple strips, and it's much easier to cut just using a ruler. When you've put your pattern pieces together, what you will find is the circles are very, very similar in shape. Now they are very slightly different each time. What I've done myself, I would recommend is using some highlighters so that you can highlight each of the different sets of pieces to keep them separate. And then last but not least, any marks that you have on the pattern pieces, before you start actually cutting out in fabric, if you use something to notch out the little triangles so you can mark them on the fabric, and if you have any circles, then use an awl or stiletto to just push through. Okay, I think you're ready to see what we're going to do next. So before you begin sewing, you will need to prepare your fabric pieces, and what that means is you're going to fuse interfacing to the wrong side of all of your pieces, and then on the outer pieces you'll also need to fuse some fusible fleece over the top, but leaving a margin all the way around so that you don't get it in your seams. Now I have left my lining to cut out in a minute because I wanted to show you first of all how I laid out my lining. If you are in the US, your fat quarters will be 18 inches, whereas in the UK ours are 20 inches. So this pattern is designed to fit an 18-inch fat quarter, but this is how you would need to lay it out. So you've got your two circles at the bottom, the pocket piece will sit nicely in the middle, and then your two gusset pieces at the top. And I don't know if you can see here, what I've done is I have pre-fused the interfacing and drawn around the circles to cut them out, because I found that was the way I got the most accurate cutting out. And what I'll do once I've actually cut out the pocket piece is I'll just literally lift up and pull away this piece of interfacing because it doesn't need it. Okay, I think you're ready to go on and make your piping. So the next thing we need to do before we actually start the process of sewing our bag is create our piping. We're going to use the piping guide for this that comes with the pattern. And as you can see on here, the circle shape is really emphasised but also created by the piping itself. It's stitched into the seam, but it's actually quite rigid and holds the circle in shape, as well as hiding any stitching. So if your circle stitching is not absolutely perfect, that's fine, because the fabric rolls around slightly into the piping and the piping makes it look perfect. Now we achieve that by our choice of piping cord. Now in general there's a couple of different kinds of piping cord available. In fact there's an extra one as well, but we're just dealing with fabric piping here. So you can use a rope piping cord, or you can use a smooth piping cord. This one was sold as an upholstery piping cord, but it is washable, so you can use it in any project. This actually is macrame cord because I haven't got any rope piping cord at the moment, but you can see the difference straight away. This one is perfect if you're going to do dressmaking, if you're going to make scallops or collars, or making your own pajamas, because it's really soft and flexible and goes into any shape. This one is a bit more rigid and it means it holds the shape really well. So if you were making a bag that you wanted the piping to form the actual shape as we are today, this is the one to go for, because it will actually hold the piece of fabric taut almost into that shape. Now to stitch piping you need a special foot, not a completely special foot, but just not, you can't use your ordinary sewing foot. So I've actually got a choice here. I've got 4 feet to show you. This is the best one, and this is a piping foot. I have a Janome one because I have a Janome machine, but you will find that you can get generic ones very easily. The way this one works is once it's on the machine, you've got an oval hole there so you can move your needle position if you're able to do that on your machine, and on the underside you've got grooves. So if you imagine that this is like a monorail, and when you are sewing it runs along your piping cord. So as long as you've got your piping cord in the correct position, your seam line will automatically be in the correct position. If you haven't got one of these and don't want to buy a new one, the second best to use is an adjustable zipper foot. And unlike this one where it runs along the piping, with this kind of foot you're going to have to actually stitch next to the piping. So just be very careful if you use this that you're not actually pushing the piping out of position with your foot, which is very easy to do. If you haven't got one of these, this again, my next best one, this is a 1/4 inch zipper foot. You usually find you have to move the machine needle position for definite when you use this foot, otherwise the center will go right down into the middle of the foot. But again, if you just slightly angled the foot to make sure you got in really tight, that would be fine. This is the zipper foot that came with my sewing machine, and you can see straight away if you're sewing from this side you're going to have a problem getting the needle in really close. So you would probably have to do everything I'm going to show you today, you'd have to do in reverse in that direction, and probably also pull everything to the maybe this side, pull everything slightly across towards you as you're sewing to make sure the needle gets in nice and tight. Okay, I will show you how we are going to measure to work out what size strips you need. So the first thing I've done with the fabric that I'm using for the piping, and that's really important because fabrics are all different thicknesses and that will affect the piping, I have just cut off the corner of the fabric. So 2.5 inches either side means I've got this lovely triangle here, which is on the bias. As you can see, means it's nice and stretchy, which helps it to go around corners. So taking my piping cord, I'm going to wrap it round and oops, I'm going to clip it into place just to hold it. Now this first test version, we need to stitch it as tightly as we can. In general, when you're stitching piping, until the very final row of stitching, you don't need to worry about how close you get to the piping, as long as it's reasonably close, because you don't want the piping moving around too much inside. But everything else we stitch, it doesn't matter if it's a millimetre or two away, but this is going to be the test version to show where our very final stitching will fall. So as we're stitching it, with your piping foot, if you can move your needle across, then do so, because we want our stitching to fall right into this gap here. So I'm going to go away and stitch that, and I will come back and show you the next step. Oh, before I do that, I've just mentioned turn your stitching length up. You're going to do quite a bit of unpicking of this deliberately, not because you've made a mistake. And obviously if you've got tiny stitches, it's going to be a pain. So turn your stitch length up to maybe 3, maybe even 3.5 if you're feeling daring, and then just stitch along here. I won't be a minute, I'll come back and show you what I've done. You'll notice that I have not changed my thread colour because I wanted you to really see this, but normally I would actually change my thread to the colour I'm doing. I'm going to bring this up to the camera. I'm never quite sure if you'll see, but I was daring and I went up to 3.5 on my stitch length, and that's it, stitched. So the next thing I'm going to do, work out what your target seam allowance is. Now my patterns are all 1/4 inch. If you're using a 3/8 or a 1/2 inch or even a 5/8, then go for that instead. But you're going to put the end of your measure to where your stitching line is and mark out where you're going to cut. Now I'm just going to mark that quickly so I've got a nice straight line, and then I'm going to cut. I'm not going to worry about getting my rotary cutter out for this. Or even my fabric scissors. Here we go. So the next thing we need to do is unpick. I've just spotted where my fabric scissors are now. I've moved everything around this morning. This does not want to, there we go. So here we go. We're going to literally just unpick the stitching. In fact, it doesn't even need proper seam ripping, it just came out by itself. Now we're going to measure this and see what it measures first, and then we're going to steam it and measure it again. There is a reason for that. Things that are cut on the bias do shrink quite a bit. So actually that's coming out at 1 inch and a 1/16. So I'm going to go and steam it, and then I will show you how much it's shrunk, and that will be how much extra we cut from what we think we need to make sure that we get the right amount. So here we are. I have really steamed this, and it actually has shrunk by that 1/16 of an inch. So it's now measuring 1 inch. So obviously if we cut it to 1 inch and it shrunk, it would be too small. So what I had originally worked out was that it would be 1 1/8, and that looks like it's going to be correct. Obviously if you do make it, steam it, and it still looks like it's actually going to be too wide, you can always just adjust it so that the edges of your fabric and your piping are not meeting, but I think we're going to be fine with this. So the next thing we need to do is work out how to cut our diagonal strips. Here's the fabric that I'm using. Now I'm actually not going to cut this out today. I am not brilliant at the moment in my shoulder, so cutting out, my friend, bless her, came over and did it for me, which was great. So I'm just going to show you though what I did for her before we cut this out. So the first thing we need to do, it doesn't matter whether you do this right side or wrong side, is we're going to get the diagonal. Now obviously you can use a patchwork ruler instead if you want to, but this is the quick and easy method of working this out. Just check that your cut edge here is parallel with the cut edge here, and you'll be fine. Then you're going to press that fold in place. So obviously not going to do that right now. When you come back, you'll have a nice press mark. You'll use your ruler and rotary cutter to cut along that mark, and then you've got your first cut. We need 3 pieces for this. I've worked out that that will be plenty. So I've ended up cutting out 3 pieces, and what I did, because if you haven't got a huge long ruler, if you are working on a small cutting desk, there's nothing to stop you, which is what we did, actually running it along the fold, so folding it in half, as long as you remember which end is the stretchy end, which is this one, and then cutting your 3 strips, and here they are. So the next thing we're going to do is go over to the machine and join them, and then we're going to stitch them into piping. So you can see I've marked the ends of my strips like I usually do. You can just mark across the whole piece at 1/4 of an inch, but basically that shows you where your crossing over points are. So I'm going to chain piece them like I usually do. It doesn't matter if it doesn't exactly cross over, because you can always trim it off a little bit later. Because there's only 3 strips here, there's only 2 lots of joins you have to do, so nice and straightforward. So what I'm going to do now is take these over to the ironing board. I'm going to press the seams open and I'm going to press the whole thing, so to take any residual stretch out of it. I mean, there will be some stretch left in it, but just to stop it from getting too small. Okay, I will see you in a second. So I'm back. You can see I have pressed my seams open, I've cut off the little triangles, and I'm ready to sew. So my machine is at 3.5 for the stitch length. I've got my piping foot on and the needle is central because we're not too worried about getting in really close to the piping at this stage. I said any stitching that you put really close to the piping, if you don't match that stitching line again, it will show if you look at in the finished article. So it's safer to leave it a tiny bit away and then later you can sort it. Now you've got two ways of doing it here. You can either put a million clips in, clip it all the way down the length and then just keep an eye on it, or you can do a little bit as you go along, which is what I prefer to do. This kind of piping cord is quite hard to it likes to try and spring in this direction. Obviously the strips will try and spring in the opposite direction, so you want to keep that centre of the piping cord as close in as possible. So what I'm going to use is my purple fang, which then I can push down and make sure that the edges are matching and that the piping cord is central. Obviously you can see the cord at the fabric at the top has to go slightly further because it has to go around the cord and then down to flatten out. So that's why we might have an issue with the edges trying to part from each other. But here we go. So what I'm going to do, before I start, I gave false start there, I said here we go. I'm going to move the clips as I go along and I'm going to go really slowly. I'm going to stop every couple of inches and move them. The more time you spend doing the preparation, as always, the better it's going to be when you come to the end. So here we go. You can already see it's trying to escape. Because that's right at the beginning, I'm not too worried. You do get into the swing of it as you're going along. In fact, I've actually now got rid of my clips because what I'm going to do is feel for it with my fingers. I'm going to try not to put my hands in front of the camera too much, but I can feel that I'm actually pushing the fabric down over the piping. Whatever you do, do not pull the cord as you're going because it will stretch it right out, and at some point in the future you might find that it bounces back in and tightens everything up when you don't want it to. Here we go. So there we have it. You can see occasionally it drifts, but not enough that it's going to make a huge difference. So what I'm going to do, I always keep my piping on the roll. I don't cut it off, because if I only end up with a little bit of fabric left over, I can just slide it off and reuse the end of the piping, start again. So that's it for now with the piping. We will go off and make our handles. So step one is creating the handles. Now we're going to be creating a faux piped handle, so that we're using the same fabric that we used for the piping. We've cut it on the bias, so it's still exactly the same direction. So this pattern, it doesn't matter, but if you have a directional pattern, it will really look the same. But what I've done is interface this to stop it from being so stretchy. If you're using a woven interfacing, you can interface it using the straight grain of the interfacing so that it doesn't stretch too much. And then we're going to make a little piece to go across the middle with that. So the first thing we're going to do is do this piece here. Now what we need to do is we need to draw a line halfway up, which in this case is 3/4 of an inch. And then we are going to press our edges into that line. There we go. So if you want to, you can press it from this side. You have to be a bit careful, because where it bounces up, when you press it, it can actually put the edges, put new creases in the wrong place. But there we go. That has actually worked. Now, what we're going to do with this piece is we're actually going to press a hem into the bottom. So I'm using my little hem maker. There we go. So the same at both ends. And then once you've done that, just fold the edges back in. And then pop a clip in them. Because the fabric's still warm, it will actually should crease back into the position you want it to be. Of course, you can use glue if you want to use some glue stick all the way down this to hold it flat to stop the edges from bouncing up. You can. I haven't in this case, but I would totally understand if you wanted to. So let's pop that to one side. Now what we're going to do with this, we're going to do exactly the same thing, but to make life a little bit easier, I'm going to use my bias maker. So this is a standard 1/2 inch bias maker. Mine came with this little stiletto awl tool to help you slide the fabric on. So what you need to do then is slide your fabric in and then use the stiletto to help it slide into the maker. Now if you can tell it's starting to crumple inside, the easiest thing to do is go to the other end of the fabric and try again. But I think, yeah, we're okay. So just pull a little bit out. At this point it doesn't matter if it looks correct, because you're going to refold that, press that, and that'll give you something to start with. So here we go. Again, be a bit careful with the iron. So we've got our little edge pressed. Now at some point you get to the point where you can pull this and everything flows naturally, but oh yeah, we are here. Sometimes you have to pull out more. This time it's smoothly wanted to go. It's showing off because it's on camera. If you keep the tip of the iron as close to the bias maker as you can, that stops it from splaying out too much. And then every so often just adjust the fabric to make sure it's coming out centrally. There we go. And again, I'm going to press it from the other side just to try and tame it. That's it with the iron now. So what we're going to do is we're going to put it raw edge to raw edge, and we're going to have a little overlap. This is going to wrap around the end and go to underneath. When it's stitched on, it will be stitched on in a little box shape around the end, so this will be hidden. Oops. So the easiest thing to do with this is pop some clips on. As you're sewing it, you might well find that this centerpiece does actually try and stretch, which is annoying, but it means you can actually just guide it with your fingers and actually make it sit flat. I'm going to start off with it clipped because it is easier. And you can see I'm just doing it by eye down the centre, although again you could use your hem guide. It's about 1/8 of an inch each side. There we go, you can see how much it's stretched because it starts off at 1/2 inch there, but you've actually got nearly 3/4 of an inch by this end. But that's fine, because once it's stitched, it will look perfect. So I will go and take that over to the machine and stitch it. To save time for you, I've got one that I prepared earlier. So here we go, let's pop that up there. This is the one that I've already made, and I just edge stitched down each side from the same direction to stop it from twisting. So I used the needle on that side, or the foot on that side, and then I use the other side of the foot to guide down to the other side. And then you can see on the back you've just got the little overhang which would be stitched in. So we have our cute faux piped handles. Now we need to attach them to our front. And on the pattern piece, we have got our handle positions marked. You can either cut them out entirely, or you can actually just put a little hole in each corner, which is what I've done here. Now, obviously what you need to do is make sure you've got the piece the correct way up. And on this, you can see that these marks are actually above the fold, above halfway. So yeah, that's the correct way up. And the easiest thing to do is lift it up slightly so that you can see the mark at the top, and line that up with the notch there, and then do the same at the bottom. So that is now in position. Now, unfortunately, I've chosen a fabric here which is really hard to mark, which I didn't think of. I just thought, oh, everybody's going to love this fabric, it's so amazing. So we'll try and mark it with the chalk. I'm not going to actually lift the pattern away completely. I'm just going to see if the marks have come through. Which... oh, I can just about see one. The other alternative is you can use pins. Mark it with a pin. No, I'm actually just going to try it with the friction pen. Sometimes a dark pen will show up on a light spot. Yay, I can see. In fact, what I'm also going to do is fold it, because that will show me where the base of my strap needs to go. And actually on this one I can see the top mark, so I got lucky there. So you're going to need to make sure it's lined up with the bottom mark and vertical. So I did put in the pattern instructions to pin it, but you can, instead of putting a pin, you can rely on yourself to hold it in place and just clip the very top, which is what I'm doing here. And bring that round. I can see the chalk marks on this side. That's sort of belt and braces, doing white chalk marks and dark pen marks. There we go. So the next thing you need to do is mark an inch up from the bottom of the strap, because that is where you're going to stitch your box. This strap is not something that is going to take a lot of weight, so you don't need to worry about rivets or doing little X's or anything like that. So there we go, you can see I've given in and gone for the friction pen. You have to be very careful with these pens on fabric because they can leave a mark, but because I'm stitching over that, it's not going to show anyway. So that is ready to take to the sewing machine. I will show you the other one, which I've completed earlier. So this is what we've done. So it's stitched in a box just around here, made sure that any little ends were tucked underneath before I stitched, and that's it from the back. So we are now ready to put our piping on. So here we are, we're ready to do our piping. Now the first thing I'm going to do, you can see I haven't got my piping foot on yet, is I'm actually going to stitch across this end. I don't know if you can see there, but where this has been cut, this piping is very hard and this fabric is very stretchy because it's on the bias. So the piping is peeking out from inside. What you tend to find over the course of a whole circle is you may have an inch or even more than an inch poking out by the time you've actually got to the end of your circle. So I'm just going to try really hard to keep my hands out of the way for you. I am struggling today to find a good place for you to have a view. I think I am one of these people that does sew by feel a lot of the time, which is not good when you're trying to show what you're doing. Anyway, so, and obviously I've got the camera set right up by my knee lift. I'm going to cut that little piece off, and then let's change foot. Oops. So I've got the piping foot on, my needle is in the centre position. Let's pop that to one side, and this is the piece that we prepared earlier. So I want my fold, my little join, to be right on this centre of this bottom mark here. Okay, so what I'm going to do, we know that the join of the piping then needs to be maybe about an inch back. So let's clip my piping about an inch back from the mark. And then we will start stitching about an inch away. So get my foot underneath. And let's just secure it with some back stitching. Now, when we put this piping on, you might be tempted, you might have seen people on videos steaming it into a beautiful curve shape. This is not what we're going to do. when this is stitched in place and flipped, the actual piping cord will be running on the other side of that seam. So we want to make sure as much as possible that it's not too tight, because it will shrink our circle quite considerably. So what I want to do is push slightly against the piping to make it curve. So I'm actually pushing the fibres together rather than pulling them apart. And then hold it in place. So this foot's fantastic because it just does all the work for us. Going to do a couple of inches at a time. You can go around and clip this whole thing if you want to. Again, I like to do things by feel, so I haven't, but I do understand people sort of that want to clip instead. And you can see what's happening slightly is the piping cord inside is very slightly buckling, not much, not enough to make it buckle on the final thing, but just enough so that it's taking the tension out of it to give us more space to flip afterwards. So I'm going to stitch around this whole section, and then when we get to the other end I will stop. We're going to stop just before where the join is, the overhang of our piping at the other end, so probably about 1.25 inches. Okay, here we go. There we go, so we have stopped. Let's take it out from under the foot for a minute. You can see that we've stopped quite a bit back from the mark to give us lots of space to move things around and unpick. Now, the first thing we're going to do is cut our piping, leaving an overhang of maybe about 1/2 inch from that mark. So again, push it slightly as you go, because you know that it will want to shrink back when you've cut it. There we go. So step 2 is to unpick. So you're going to actually unpick all the way back to the stitching you've just finished there, or thereabouts. That will do. This is why we used big stitches earlier, to make this an easier thing to do. There we go. So the next thing we're going to do is use a couple of clips to hold this into position, the other end, so that we know we've got that nice curve there. And we want to cut our piping. So cut it as close as you can to where the end is there. Move that out of the way and take the clips out. We're just going to work with the end that's closest to the fabric now. We're going to curve that round till we get to our mark, which you can see there, and I'm going to fold the flap of the fabric back at that mark. Finger press it just to give it a nice crease. Then I'm going to pop that in there to hold it for a second. Then curve this back into place. Lift up your clip and reposition it again. And then pull this top layer over. Yeah, we've got it in the place we wanted to, so that's good news. So if it looks a little loose inside the piping, don't worry too much because we will sort that all out later. Just keep the curve. There we go, let's push it right back up to the edge. And let's stitch our gap closed. And there we go. So when that flips back, you've just got that little neat overlap there. When we look on the back, the seam allowance looks pretty good. You know, sometimes it's a little bit further away, sometimes it's a tiny bit closer, but when we go round with our final row of stitching, we'll get that in nice and tight and it will look just right. There we go. So the next thing we're going to do is we are going to prepare our zip and gusset to be attached to the side pieces. So back again, I've moved the camera yet again. I'm still looking for the optimum angle. Who knows, by the end of this video, I might even have found it. So what we're doing here, I've got the little zipper pull tabs and you can see they were originally flat. I folded them in half, pressed them, opened it out, folded both ends into the center, pressed again, and then folded one more time. So now all we're going to do is edge stitch them. So turn your stitch length up. So I've turned mine up to 3, and this is a bit of fun sewing. So there we have our finished end tabs, and now we're going to start working with our zipper. So this is a number 5 zip. You can tell because it's got the wider tabs and the teeth themselves measure 5mm. And I've got 13.5 inches here, and these tabs we're going to put one at each end. Just makes it easier when the bag is finished to actually pull the zipper open and shut. And of course, if you wanted to, you could add a little D-ring to the end of each to put a strap on. So I'm going to pop this on temporarily, because what we need to do in a second, I'm not going to put my 1/4 inch foot on for this, as much as I love it, because I do find it gets very hard sometimes to go over ridges like the zipper here. So what I'm going to do instead is I'm actually going to measure and mark a 1/4 inch. So, oops. This is going to be where we're stitching this. And then the next seam that we come to stitch will be further in still to give us the right size. So I'm just going to pop that on there just to hold it. Definitely need your hump jumper for this. So let's get it all positioned first, and then I can take the clip out. So hold it in place with your hand. Line it up so you can see where you're going to stitch. Oops. And I usually start further in, so perhaps in the middle of the piece, and then stitch forward, reverse all the way back, and then stitch forward again, because that stops the edges of the folded zipper pull from moving apart. If your hump jumper moves and has shifted out of the way, you might need to put it back in again, which mine has. So just going to pop it back in. There we go. I'm going to do the same to the other end. So now we're going to stitch on our gusset pieces. So take your gusset pieces. The end with the mark is your centre bottom. So in fact, pretty much the only reason the mark really needs to be there is to remind us which end's the top and which end's the bottom. And on mine, you can see both my pieces. I've got the red colour at one end. So what we're going to do now with this is we are going to pop it up against the stitching line that we've just created. So essentially what we're going to end up with is 1/2 inch of zipping that we can sew inside the piece, which just for me it gives us a little bit more security that in use it's not going to get yanked around and get pulled out. So I'm going to do the same thing again, although actually the fusible fleece is in exactly the right position. So you will need to use your hump jumper again. In fact, the only parts of this bag I thought that were a little bit more challenging to sew were all around this zipper pull. But without it, it just makes the bag so much harder to use. And I think we have to sometimes just challenge ourselves a little bit. So here we go. Yeah. Did not want to go there, but persevere. That's better. So I'm going to do the same at the other end. There we go. So you can see that's stitched in exactly the same at the other end. And then to complete the circle, we're going to stitch a 1/4 inch seam at the bottom end. So you can match your marks. There we go. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go and press this open, and then we'll get one of our outer pieces, our side pieces, and we will join them together. So we are motoring through this pattern now, and the next stage we're going to do is actually going to make our pieces look like a bag. So I've taken one of the sides, and if you remember the marks we put at the back, that's how we're going to orientate our gusset properly. The first thing we need to do before we do that though is find the center point of the zip. Now I realize that this is going to be very difficult to mark, so let's just hope I can make the mark show. If not, I'll just have to put a pin in. Oh, there we go. No, I have managed to mark it on the piece. Okay, so if you're putting a special front on one side of the bag, then you need to bear in mind that the zip normally closes to the left and pulls, but if both sides are exactly the same, it really doesn't matter at all. So we're going to go right sides together, and what I always like to do first is pin the cardinal points rather than clip them, only because I know I am fully capable of pulling clips along and then everything ends up in the wrong place. So the mark at the sort of upper side is the mark that matches where the zip begins. Put a pin in there. Same on the other side. And then that centre mark that I just made matches the centre. So 4 marks, 4 pins. Everything else though I'm going to clip, because the clips do hold things nice and steady. And what I would recommend is sort of not immediately working from one side to the other, because if you've got any flex in your piece it will push it all to one side, but to do it by eye and start by clipping in the middle and then working your way out and then putting more clips in. Now, if for any reason your circle has ended up very tight, which is possible if your piping managed to pull or anything like that, you can always take this seam apart and re-stitch it. You'd probably need to make an adjustment to the lining as well for the same reason. But there we go. So one in the centre. I'm not too worried about how many clips I put in for the fabric to fabric, but I am going to put so many clips in for doing fabric to zipper, only because the zipper itself, the teeth have got to run against the edge of the piping foot, and I really don't want them pushing apart and pushing the zip out of position. So when we come to sew, I'll show you how I take a bit of extra care to keep the zip in position. And obviously you could use glue if you wanted to, but I have chosen just to use clips. Obviously what you're also feeling for is that the piping is pushed across. There we go. So that is all clipped in position. I'm going to go over to the sewing machine next. Notice I've just at the moment left my zipper pull in the centre, but we will definitely have to move it around because the piping foot won't go over that. Okay, let's go to the sewing machine. So here we are, we've got the piping foot on the machine. So you've got the usual stitch length, and what I'm going to do here is start off by popping it over the piece. Now you can see I'm working with the gusset facing upwards. That's so we don't have any ripples or any little pulls under there. So I'm going to take out my thing. I'm not too worried about how many clips you use on this side because I can pull the fabric. It's got a very slight stretch to it. So I'm just going to go round. You'll see the piping runs like it's on a monorail. I'm going to keep an eye on it and make sure there's no little folds. What you tend to find is every so often you need to lift up the foot to release the excess fabric so it can go behind the foot. Other than that, this bit's fairly straightforward. So as we get round to this section where the zip starts, this is where the most bulk is. So you can actually use a hump jumper with your piping foot. Just be aware that it won't be sitting on the track because you've lifted it up higher, but I hopefully won't need it yet. I'll soon let you know. Ooh. If you can't find your hump jumper, you know you have to look for it behind the machine. So I'm just going to put it under one side of the back of the foot just to lift it up enough to go over this lump here. Oh, look at that. I'm going to stitch pretty close to the pin and then remove it. And now this is the point where this zipping tape is usually pretty flexible, so it will want to spread and go into the wrong position. So there we go. Actually, this is not too bad, but what I found with one of the other ones I used, which had a much more flexible tape, was I ended up sliding the clips along, so I will show you that. So I literally just slid it further along. So you definitely need to move this, so you're actually going to end up opening the zip at this point, or closing it by the looks of things from where I have my zip. You can see as soon as you pull anything away, the tape wants to pull away from the edge because obviously it's straight and we're making it go around to curve. So I am going to go back to the trick of sliding the clips. If anything doesn't feel right, you can just lift up the foot and push it all back into position. Again, you might need to use your hump jumper. I said if you didn't put the zipper tab in, you wouldn't have this issue at all, but having a pull tab does make the bag so much easier to use. There we go. It's just making sure it gets back onto the piping, onto the right track when it comes around the other side. And we're back to the straightforward bit now. Here we go. So this is the point to have a jolly good look at it. Make sure you haven't got any little ripples. Check that it looks all right where you've put it around the zip. As you can see, this looks okay. Always check at the danger points like this. So there's the possibility I've actually gone a bit too far in on the zip, but actually when you look at it, it looks absolutely fine, so I'm not worried about that. There we go. So I'm going to go ahead and do the second one, and although it says in the pattern don't turn it through, I'm going to turn it through so you can have a sneak peek. So here is the moment of truth. We will just check that everything is okay, and if it is, we are going to do our final row of stitching. By okay, I don't mean 100% perfection. You don't need to get a tiny ruler out and check, but you just need to look at it and think, yeah, that gusset looks about right. Which it does, so you can see some of the stitching showing on the piping. We are going to deal with that in a second. That's okay. I'm happy with that. You can see how cute it looks. So, turn it back through, and we are going to change our stitch position, our needle position, and then we're going to stitch from the circle side as close as we can possibly get. So my needle, it says 3.5. I've switched it to 3. You can hear a lot of building work going on. That is my studio being made. So the next time I film a video, with any luck, I'll be in the studio and have a bit more space to play around with camera positions. We're very tight at the moment. Okay, so here we go. Let's just double check that the needle is further in. Yep. So you can see there the stitching is just that little bit further in. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to lift this up. I don't know if you've ever seen those lovely baskets made from cord. But people lift them up and it just means that actually the foot is running more straight over the cord, which means that it can get in closer. There we go. So you can clearly see we are closer in than we were before. So that will tighten our stitching line right up. Open it out and you can see the difference. So here we go. That's really nice and tight. No stitching showing at all compared to the other side, where you can see it's a little bit looser and you can still see a little bit of stitching. So I'm going to go ahead and do the other side, and then we will be working on our lining. And now it's time to tackle our lining. So before we actually stitch the lining together, we need to create our pocket. So this is the piece here. You can see it's got a couple of lines here which indicate where we're going to fold and press to create our casing. And then we've got some dots and marks at the bottom here which are going to show us how to create our pleats. So there's the piece that I have already. I actually pressed it using this hem gauge, folded it up, pressed again, and in a minute I will go and edge stitch that along the lower edge. But before we do that, I'm just going to demonstrate to you how the pleats work. So let's turn this over to the other side. Now we're actually going to start by folding our piece back, and we use our dots and a couple of pins to make sure that we've got everything level. So at the moment that is correct. Let's just grab another pin and that is correct. So that shows us, if you lift the pins up vertically, it pulls the fabric together so it's in the correct place. And then we can just finger press the edge of the pleat, and now we're going to flip that back. There we go. I take the pins out. I'm actually going to put a pin in place because it will actually keep the pleat nice and level. We're not going to stitch it, and this is going to be released afterwards, but it means that our pleats are going to be just right. So otherwise what will tend to happen, you go to pleat it along the bottom, fold it through, the pleat ends up not being quite correct, and then this shape doesn't quite work. So I'm going to take that out for now. I'm going to go and stitch this, and then I will put the elastic in. So we've stitched our casing. I've edge stitched it pretty close to the edge, which gives plenty of room for the gathers to form around the elastic. Now our elastic is a 1/4 inch elastic or thereabouts, and we've got 10 inches of it. So because we want to have 1/4 inch sticking out the end, and because we don't want it sliding through the casing, I'm actually going to put a pin in at 1/4 inch in so that it will stick out and hold everything in place. You could use a proper bodkin, but I have a whole pack of quilting safety pins, so that's what I'm using. So I'm going to go and stitch over the ends here and then form the pleats, and then I'll show you where to put the pocket on the piece. So on this piece, I don't know if you remember, this has extra marks on it. So this top mark here is the mark for the top of the gusset or the top of the zip. That's obviously the centre mark, and this one down here is the mark for the pocket placement, and we have a centre mark. So that will match here. And then the centre bottom mark will match as well. The elastic is very, very slightly smaller than this, so that when the bag is inside, it will sit nicely and won't flop forward. I mean, it does flop forward a little bit, but it won't flop forward as badly as you would otherwise have. So I'm going to stitch all the way around to hold this together, and then we'll treat this as one piece. So we're going to put on our gusset now. I have already used my 1/4 inch foot to make a hem in the bottom, and I use the dots to show me where to fold and press here. So as I like to do, I'm going to use a pin to start it off. Now we want this to start just past the line for the gusset, so that when it all goes together, this should then, with any luck, cover the stitching line on the inside of the zip. So I'm going to do the same on both sides. So probably about maybe a 1/16 of an inch, not very much, but just enough that I know it will cover. Obviously, as things shift, it might not cover, but we're hoping that it will. So I've matched this to the bottom mark, and then this is exactly the same as we did for the outer. Okay, I'm going to go and stitch this. You can use a 1/4 inch seam because I've already made the adjustments in the lining. And the one other thing I'm going to mention, obviously I mentioned that if things shift, to stop things shifting, because one of the versions that I did, they did actually shift, which is my fault. I'm actually going to stitch just both those ends first to hold them nicely in position, then stitch all the way around. So that's the first side done. I can now take out the pins because we know that our pleats are stitched in correctly, so they're nice and vertical. And now we need to stitch the other side. Now what we need to remember is that we need to leave a turning gap. So I like to leave about 6 inches. You can leave less if you want to, but it makes it easier to pull through if it's slightly more. So I'm marking it on the gusset because I'm going to stitch with the gusset facing upwards again, and then we're going to pin and stitch exactly like we have for everything else. There we go. So I'm going to go and stitch that, leaving the turning gap. You may notice I've put some pins in and clips inside where I'm going to leave the turning gap, but that's just to make sure the fullness is distributed properly. Okay, we'll be back with a finished lining. So here we have our finished lining. So you can see the stitching from where we just stitched the pocket on temporarily is now hidden, the elastic's nicely stitched in, and we've left our turning gap at the bottom here. So the one last thing we have left to do is to use pinking shears to trim down. If you don't have pinking shears, you can always just trim it with scissors and then put some little notches that you take out. This will just release any of the tension. So what I'm doing though is I'm not going to go all the way up to the top there because we know that that's going to be quite close to the outer and to a gap, so we want to make sure we've got plenty of fabric to pull that around. And the other thing you'll see is I'm not trimming the turning gap. Or the elastic. and we're ready to join it to the outer. We have our lining piece finished and we have our outer finished. The only other thing we need to do with the outer, we'll just do that quickly, is trim it like we did the lining. Don't trim the zip. We've got very narrow seam allowance with the zip and they can fray. So there we go. Now I'm going to place these like this with the open edges facing together, because we're not going to do the usual and put the lining inside the bag or the bag inside the lining, because we've got this zip here, and we're just going to attach this lining to the top down to, well, just below here on the inside. So what we're going to do is take the top of the lining and the top of the bag, and I'm going to match the center top mark. So there we go. And as usual, I'm going to pin it so that there's no chance that I'm going to be able to pull it out. Then we're going to match the marks at the side. Now, the best thing to do is if you fold the gusset away inside, because actually we can stitch down further and that will help anchor it nicely to the top of the bag. So there's our mark. I'm actually going to put a pin there. And there it is. So again, I'm going to pop a pin in here. You can tell this is going to be the bit that we're going to hate because of the fact that it is bulky now. But again, just go slowly. And do you know what? If you gave up and finished off the last little bit by hand, nobody's going to judge you. But if you just grit your teeth and work patiently, you should be able to do it by machine. There we go. So the rest of it I'm going to clip. Now, often when you do things like this, you can actually prepare both sides at the same time. I'm not going to do that with this one, purely because moving the zipper pull out of the way is quite difficult anyway, particularly if you've got a sort of long dangly zipper pull like the one I've put into this bag. But if you can leave the other side open, you've got this big section here to get your hand in. When you come to do the second side, you'll have to go in through the hole in the lining, which obviously means you've got less visibility. So we're matching our edges exactly as we have before. And then I'm just going to put a couple of clips in to bring it a bit further down, probably to just above where the elastic is on that side. So yeah, it doesn't matter how far, but just try and match the seams. I'll put a clip a bit further away from where we're aiming at going. You can always mark it if you want to. And then when we stitch, we're going to stitch round, following our previous stitching lines where possible. This is the point I would suggest using a thread colour that's going to match your zipping rather than your fabric, because if anything is likely to show, it's likely to be on the zipping. So hopefully not. In fact, I'm not going to change my thread colour. But if you were worried about that, you could change it to the same colour as the zipping. Okay, I'm ready to go and sew. So we're ready to stitch. Notice this time I've got my hump jumper ready and I've got my piping foot on. And what I've decided to do to help me later is just actually do a little bit of stitching just at the end here and at the other end, but from the side with the outer, so that I can actually make sure that nothing pulls out of place. It's very hard when you've got all of these layers. Sometimes you literally can't see what you're doing. So this should just give me a little bit of help. There we go. So that's almost basted it into place. I'm going to do the same at the other side. So this is below the mark that we had. Right, so now we're going to work from the other side. So this side uppermost, so we can see what we're doing. And I'm actually going to go over the stitching that I've just done. Now the reason that is actually very helpful is you can feel with your fingers there, as soon as you get to this section where the zipper pull is, it is suddenly much harder to feel where exactly the piping is. So I think it's there. I can just about feel it with my finger. So we'll work on the idea that it's there. Other than that, we're just going to stitch round. You're going to have to feel for the zipper pull and just keep making sure that your edges of your lining is lining up with the edge of your fabric, your outer. So we can come back in later if we need to. I can feel I'm anytime you work with a circle, you always run the risk of things actually stretching or moving out of shape. Now I'm going to need my hump jumper again here. You can see I'm just putting it on half of the foot rather than underneath like I would normally do. And then here we go. We made it all the way around. We've got no creases, which is excellent. And in general, it looks like our stitching is in the correct place. What I'll do is we'll turn this through quickly and have a look and make sure it's okay. That looks pretty much fine. We'll go through later and do the thing that we did before where we actually stitch more closely, but first of all we are going to prepare and stitch the other side. So I will do that off camera and then I will show you that when it's finished. So here we are. I have finished stitching both sides. I have a confession to make. The second side I absolutely couldn't get the zip moved, so all I did was I finished off the stitching, took the work off the machine, moved the zipper pull and then restarted from the same place. Sometimes you just got to do what you got to do. So here we go, the moment of truth. So we're attached on both sides. we've got a hole in the lining, and we're going to put our hand in and pull it through. The reason we're doing this at the machine is we've got another couple of minor pieces of machining to do, and then we can go and give everything a good steam. There we go. So pulled through. I'm going to make sure, oops, I've actually pushed out all of the shape. Oops. And there's our zip. So got a couple of little tufts of thread, which just happens particularly when you're doing a lot of rows of stitching, but otherwise that's not bad. So what I'm going to do now is push the lining inside, and then I'll show you these ends here. Ooh, got another little nest of thread there, which I'll deal with in a second. These ends here we need to stitch across. So this is why we wanted to make sure that this bit was level, and this is why the fold had to be slightly higher than the mark, so that it covers up that row of stitching just there. And what we're going to need to do then, you can either finish that by hand if you want to, or you can do it on the machine. So to do it on the machine, you need to turn the bag inside out. And then we need to change foot. I've got the hump jumper there, but this bit is surprisingly easy. It's fiddly, but actually, because you've got the piping there, you can pull the piping back. As long as this is in the correct place on the underside, you will be fine. So pull the piping back on both sides with your fingers, and then pop it under the machine, straighten it out so you can see where you're stitching. I would turn your stitching back up, stitch length back up, because we are top stitching here. And then first of all, just make sure you've got your needle in the right place. Then if your lining's a completely different colour than the outer, then just make sure you're using a thread on the inside that matches your lining. There we go. So just stitch that, and on the inside, apart from the thread nest, which is I will deal with in a minute, it's stitched. Okay, I will do the other side, and then we need to stitch up the gap in the lining. So here we are. It's all turned through, as you can see. Piping is giving it a beautiful circle shape. Just thought I'd let you know that to keep the zipper out of the way when I was stitching that end there, I just put a little pin in to hold it up. So the last thing we're going to do is we're going to stitch up our gap in the lining. So normally when I do these, if it's on a straight seam, I like to press it before I turn it through, but obviously it's very hard to do that with a circle. So what I'm going to do, oops, is I'm going to pop a pin in so that the centre marks are lined up, and then I'm going to try and get rid of any little thread bits, because once they're stitched in they are more of a pain to get out. So I'm going to match this and then I will stitch it. There we go. So to do that, I make sure I pull out the seam, because we're going to start stitching a little bit before. I'm going to make sure my needle is pretty close to the edge. There we go, apart from that little thread which I shall pull. We've still got the nice circle shape, and when you stitch by machine it has the added bonus of pulling up the lining so it's even tighter. There we go. So next thing I'm going to do is take it over to the ironing board and we'll give it a good steam and a press, and then you can see the finished article. And we're very nearly there. Now you can skip this step if you want to, but I do like to finish things off nicely. So what I'm actually going to do is very lightly press and steam the gusset so it will stand away from the piping. I apologise again for my noisy iron. It is not on a high temperature, but it steams like crazy, so I think it might be being replaced soon. There we go. So I'm going to flip it over and do the other side. So it looks to start with like you're making things worse, but it's just making sure that everything stands up nicely and that all the depth of the gusset is actually showing properly. And when the bag's in use it will sort of turn almost into like a little macaroon type shape, so it will actually push forward. But let's start off by exposing it properly. There we go. So I'll put my hand inside, just reshape that, and very quickly going to press the lining away from the zip, again carefully because you don't want to melt the zip. And that's put lots of steam into here already. Now, the easiest way to steam, you don't really want to press your iron against this because it will collapse everything. Let's flip that around. I'll literally just steam it. We'll do the other side and then leave it to cool. There we go, just brings the shape back out. Take off any little threads. So that's it. Well, congratulations! If you've got to the end of this video and you've been sewing along with me, you should have a bag that looks something like this. So faux piped handles, lovely round piping on the bag itself, and a cute little elasticated pocket inside. I have a pattern that comes out every 2 months. I'm in the process at the moment of making videos for my older patterns, so hopefully if you watch this space you will start to see some of those pop up ready for you to sew along with me. Other than that, I would say follow me on Facebook, on Instagram, Pinterest, and obviously on YouTube. And you could join my Facebook group as well, which I share with Vicky from Sew Fabulous Fabrics, if you want to learn more about sewing. Thank you for joining me. See you again soon. Bye.